this is where the bridges over the River Seym come in, because knocking those bridges out means that the Russians have a great or an inability to supply the Glushkovsky district. And it's that which means that even though they sort of may have put some pontoon bridges up, which the Ukrainians have already destroyed one, it seems that you're getting to a blitzkrieg type concept of the cauldron, a pocket where 3,000 Russian troops may be on the wrong side of that river, with potentially a double envelopment from the Ukrainians. And this, again, is where people don't understand the psychology of war. They understand the physical part, where if the enemy get behind you, as the Ukrainians will, this is when you have a collapse of morale and mass surrenders. If that happens, that would be pretty bad news for Russia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and the incursion into the Kursk region. And I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, Major General Chapman, a former British military advisor to US Central Command, who served for 33 years in the armed forces. He's also a respected commentator on geopolitics and security, and is the author of the book Notes from a Small Military. General Chapman, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hello, James. A pleasure to be here.
I mean, we have so much to discuss. I wanted to first of all get your thoughts on what we've seen in the past 24 hours or so, which is this pretty major drone attack on Moscow. What is your analysis of it?
Well, there have been drone attacks before on Moscow, so it's the scale of this one which is slightly different. We're not quite sure if one or two of the 11 got through. What it plays into really is this abundant and accumulating vulnerability which we see to Russia. It's worth saying, of course, that it's not the first time, and it's the range really, because although there's a restriction on the use of certain NATO weapons, we need to remind ourselves that on the 25th of July, for example, Ukrainian drones struck Elenya airfield in the Murmansk region when a number of backfire bombers were hit. That is 1,800 kilometers from the front line. And Moscow is something like, in a direct line, if you're flying there, 841 kilometers. So that is well beyond the reach of, for example, the HIMARS rockets. So what it really shows us is that Ukraine are producing their own drones. They can be successful. And what you do after these attacks, be they failed or otherwise, is you do a battlefield damage assessment and a thing we call the measurement of effectiveness assessment, which is why did it potentially fail? What routes can we use in the future? What height do we fly at, for example? And how can we make it better so that we succeed? So, Moscow would argue that the layered defense worked, and it probably did, but flights were cancelled at various Moscow airports. And it is that, as I said, this accumulating vulnerability with the fact that Moscow can be hit, there's an incursion in Kursk, all these things with population fleeing can play into this fact of the psychological aspect of war, which I often bang on about, because people just look at things in a physical sense, but it's the collapse of will or the contribution to the collapse of will that is ultimately the key thing in war. Now, you have to be slightly careful because we see a partial view of the war, and two of the key things about being an analyst is you've got to be very careful that you're not adopting optimism bias and availability bias, but of the things that you see.
I mean, that's a really good point, but your sense is this plays into the wider Ukrainian tactic of taking the war to Russia in the same way we're seeing in the Kursk region with the incursion, and now we're seeing it in Moscow with this large-scale drone attack.
Well, in terms of their deep battle, I think it now shows that there are three types of targets. The first one are the oil refineries, and we have heard some talk in the last week, don't know if it's true or not, that there was going to be some sort of you don't strike ours and we don't strike yours in terms of oil refineries or electricity generation in Ukraine. So the oil refineries attacks, deep battle attacks by the Ukrainians are working, I think. And we see this by the fact that, again, from the 1st of September to the 31st of December, there's going to be a further ban on gasoline exports from Russia. So the oil refineries is the first deep battle target. The second one, which the Kursk incursion helps with, is the airfield. So trying to knock out the airfields in the west of Russia, which host the aircraft which are targeting Ukrainian cities. And that is why, for example, that airfield, the Olenya airfield in Murmansk, was attacked on the 25th of July. And the third one is, Moscow is the capital city, and therefore it's iconic. If you infuse that vulnerability there, then that is going to have an impact at some stage. Now, that doesn't mean that, I've often said that there's an eroding stalemate. It's pretty slow erosion at the moment. Some stage there is likely to be a landslide. It's very, very difficult to see when that landslide will be. What I would say about the Kursk operation from a political level at the moment for Putin is that, of course, they've not defined it as a military operation from their perspective. The FSB has the lead. It's been deemed a counter-terrorist operation. And that is deliberate because it therefore is not deemed to be a state of war, and martial law has not been declared. And at the moment, that should prevent any blowback on Putin until you have either mass casualties or other things that occur, which could happen again in a sort of micro sense of what is happening in Kursk at the moment.
I just want to pick up on what you just said there about a landslide. By that, do you mean a decisive shift in momentum at some point during this war? And do you think we're close to that?
It's very, very difficult to say that. What you can say, again, from an historical perspective, for example, is that in this same period of time in 1918, at the end of the Battle of Amiens, the Allies went 7 miles in a week, and that was deemed to be the black day for the German army. No Allied troops ever were in Germany in the First World War. So to say from when you go to an eroding position to a landslide is very, very difficult to measure. I've often said that there are 3 variables here that we look at. Firstly, are the population fed up and therefore want a change in their political polity? And I think one of the interesting things about the Kursk incursion has been how benign the Russian population have been. They just don't seem to be that bothered by the Ukrainian incursion. Neither do they seem to be up in arms about Putin. Now, if they haven't got services, then that might come to fruition. And one of the things that the Ukrainians might be trying to do is to make sure that there's no electricity passing across that region to Belgorod. And therefore, if you've got no electricity in that region and the lights go black or the lights go out, that can have an impact on the people. And I think the interesting thing from the Kursk thing, again, this plays into the fact that it's deemed a CT operation, and the fact that it's in Russian territory means that conscripts can be used, because although they can't be used abroad, they can be used in Russian territory. Now, the conscripts, should they be used, are pretty badly trained. And if you have a large number of body bags occurring, then you do get into this aspect of potentially the mothers of Russia kicking off, which happened, of course, in the Afghanistan war. But the will to challenge the regime from the population and the mothers has not been there at the moment. There's been no divide and rule there. So let's take the population aside from that one. The second thing we always say is that the army might revolt, as they did in the First World War, which led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, of course. We're not really seeing that at the moment. Could be again, because you will see, I think, when we get on to the tactics of Kursk, that there's going to be more bad news for Russia. And the third aspect, of course, is if the political polity or the elites defect around Putin. But at the moment, the elites aren't defecting around him. They stayed with him largely after the Prigozhin sort of march on Moscow, and most of them are culpable in the war anyway. So everything at the moment looks manageable from a Russian perspective as we stand on the 18th day of this incursion. What, from a military perspective, is unusual is that although Ukraine achieved surprise, which we always say can have a force multiplier of 3 times its worth in combat terms, that surprise normally dissipates between 1 to 3 days. Here we are on day 16, and they still seem to be going forward, and that surprise has not decayed. So that's unusual. So the Russian response has not been vigorous as you think it might be or should be.
Yeah, I want to come back to the situation on the ground in Kursk in a moment. I mean, just on that point about the threats to Putin's position, on Times Radio earlier on, we spoke to Sean Bell, military analyst and former fighter pilot, and he was saying that he thinks actually Putin is vulnerable potentially to a kind of palace coup from oligarchs. And I hear what you say, Chip, that there's no sign of it at the moment. But I suppose if you are in the political elites around Putin in Russia, you don't show your hand. I mean, to do so would put you in mortal danger. So some of these conversations will be happening on a very low level, in very hushed voices in the corridors of power. Do you think we might be closer to that than we've been for some time?
No. So to answer the question, is Putin weakened? You would say no if you believe, as I do at the moment, the entire Siloviki, the military political establishment, is complicit in the war. To answer Sean's point about yes, that would be he is vulnerable because you're not seeing a great patriotic swelling of patriotism after the incursion into Kursk, or because he may have lost his image as Russia's protector because the Ukrainians are in Kursk. But because it's a marginal region from a Russian perspective, he can overcome that because he still thinks that he holds the strategic whip hand in terms of a long war where the West will get fed up with it, and therefore he will be able to have the terms that he wants for some sort of future negotiations. I think that's also dangerous for him at the moment, though, because one of the notions of peace has always been a frozen peace. Well, a frozen peace when you've got Ukrainian troops on your soil doesn't look any good. And of course, the Chinese, for example, the Chinese peace plan, which came out in February 23, the first anniversary of the war, did talk about a demilitarized zone up to the Dnieper, i.e., all the way through the sort of Donetsk region, and from a Chinese perspective, incorporating Zaporizhia and Kherson. Now, we can now potentially reverse that and say, hang on, let's have a DMZ, demilitarized zone, on the Russian side of the border, because this isn't necessarily the end of the operation from a Ukrainian perspective. One of the things I think is interesting is I'm not sure if the Russians think that this is just a feint in the same way that the Germans thought that Normandy wasn't the main effort for the Allies in June 44. So they might be expecting something else somewhere else. That could be another incursion in Belgorod. It could be a move down through Zaporizhia, could be through Kherson. And it's that keeping the enemy on the horns of a dilemma, which is the key thing in terms of the future of how the Ukrainians develop this operation in Kursk, or something that goes with the operation in Kursk. So Putin is not vulnerable at the moment, and that would be overplaying the mark severely.
I mean, what would you do if you were General Siersky and you're thinking, okay, we've taken this territory in Kursk. Do we try and consolidate that, or do we, at some point in a few weeks' time, tactically withdraw and then launch further cross-border raids into Russia?
Well, again, some of the analysis I think has been sort of way off mark early on in terms of saying this is a gamble. It is not. It's a risk. But with a risk, you can always recover from a risk in the way that you can't recover from a gamble. So again, in terms of my analysis of this, I never really saw the Ukrainians doing a season hold operation of everything that you see marked on a map. And that is because ground has no value by itself. So to quote the figures, for example, which we had from yesterday, which was that the Ukrainians had captured 1,263 kilometers square and 93 settlements. That is meaningless in terms of ground, because it's the relationship between ground enemy time and space, which is the important thing. And from a defensible perspective, you look at what is vital ground and key terrain, i.e. that is ground that you can defend. So there was never going to be a season hold of everything that's turned blue on the Russian side of the border. And if the ground becomes important, you're then going to have a season maintain where the key terrain matters to you and that you can adopt a bastion defense. And this is where the bridges over the River Seym come in, because knocking those bridges out means that the Russians have a great or an inability to supply the Glushkovsky district. And it's that which means that even though they sort of may have put some pontoon bridges up, which the Ukrainians have already destroyed one, it seems that you're getting to a blitzkrieg type concept of the cauldron, a pocket where 3,000 Russian troops may be on the wrong side of that river, with potentially a double envelopment from the Ukrainians. And this again is where people don't understand the psychology of war. They understand the physical part, where if the enemy get behind you, as the Ukrainians will, this is when you have a collapse of morale and mass surrenders. If that happens, that would be pretty bad news for Russia, but it's 3,000 max, and that would be manageable for Putin because, of course, it is an informational autocracy. And although things are getting out about what's happening in Kursk, it's not getting out in the way that it might if this was a democracy with bad news on a daily basis.
What do you think the primary objective of the Kursk incursion is? I mean, I've heard a lot of people increasingly say maybe this is designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies to prove once and for all that Putin is bluffing about some of his red lines.
I think there's an element of that to it. I always say from a military perspective that if you're doing military operations just for the means of signalling, then that's not really a military operation. That is a political effect of the operation, and jolly good it is too. But I think it is that point to try and alter the calculus of the war, at least partially, in terms of seizing the momentum. Let's try and take some of the initiative and show that we're not doing this thing, which I've said in the last, I think, two interviews, that Ukraine were losing slowly, and that with the addition of the American aid package in particular, they'd equalised the battlefield. And now at least there's some hope for the future. Now, in terms of the future, that is really important because a population and a nation are willing to endure if they have hope for the future and a better future, which Ukraine obviously sees both in the EU and NATO, and that they have trust in their leadership. If you can erode that on the Russian side, then that is where this eroding stalemate may come in. But as I keep saying, I don't know when it's going to be a landslide because autocracies always seem secure right up to the moment that they're not. And I know you're very young, James, but for example, Ceausescu in sort of the 1989 terms, no one was really expecting the collapse of those regimes. Not going to happen in the near term, I don't think. So I think we're getting carried away if we use that very Western paradigm to think that will happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I mean, just to be clear though, on your language around a landslide, do you think it will happen at some point?
I do think it will happen at some time, and none of us will be able to predict that. But if you're predicting that in the next week or next month, I think you're delusional.
Yeah. Obviously, one of the big debates at the moment, to go back to the point about whether this is meant to send a signal to Ukraine's Western allies, is the use of storm shadows in Ukraine, but also some of the longer range ATACMS as well. Were the West to loosen some of those restrictions, how do you think Ukraine would use those weapons, and what impact would that have?
Well, it would go back to their targeting strategy again. So it would be against the oil refineries. It would be against the airfields. I don't think the West will ever allow them to use them on Moscow. Not that any of them have that range, as I sort of said earlier. It would have a massive impact because one of the things that the Ukrainians have done very well with the Kursk incursion, in the way that they may not have in the offensive in 2023, is that they seem to have used a sort of multi-brigade combined arms approach where they've got a very good air defense umbrella, what we call A2AD, so anti-access area denial, where they've kind of pushed the Russian aviation back, and they've cleverly at the same time integrated JDAM, joint attack munitions, onto their Soviet-era planes so that they can support the operation. So that's all been in their favour. So it looks pretty good at the moment. But the seize and maintain that I mentioned early on will only hold as long as the Ukrainian generalship want it to. And one of the things the Ukrainians have also done very well over the course of the war is they know when to withdraw and when the opportunities for exploitation have gone. Now, I think that they will endure there for quite a time. Now, Putin has said that he wants that operation in Kursk wrapped up and the Ukrainians to have been kicked out by the 1st of October. I think that's pretty optimistic at the moment, looking at how Ukraine can use that high ground over the River Seym and interdict, because they have a drone first-person view sort of frontage, really, about 25k, 15 miles over that river with their first-person view drones, which means that they can interdict the any convoys coming that way, and they've done that pretty well. Now, again, to make sure that I'm not being too optimism biased from a Ukrainian perspective, the biggest reserve that the Russians really have, if they chose to lose it, but because of the A2AD, they might lose some more planes than they want, is that their aviation and air is potentially their best reserve, but they might not want to use it there. And let's be clear, they haven't moved anything from their main effort, which is still in Donetsk, and at the attack towards Pokrovsk.
And do you think that what we're seeing at the moment could be the thing that spurs Putin into ordering a fresh wave of mobilization?
No, because I think that is absolutely risky for Putin. He's willing to sacrifice Kursk as a region, but I think trying to go for a mobilization would sacrifice his future, and I think there would be an uprising. So if that were to be a decision point, as we would call it in the military, and were he to do that, then that is a significant political risk to him, and I don't think he will take it. So what we're going to see at the moment is more of those conscripts used within the battle space, because it is in Russia, and that's the way it will be. That's not to say that they are the only people there. So we know, for example, that the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, or elements of them, are in the Kursk region, along with the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade. So there's a risk of using the convicts, and there's a risk of mobilization. There's less of the risk at the moment of using the convicts than there is of mobilization.
And just finally, what are the key things that you'll be tracking in the next week or so to monitor the progress of this incursion?
Well, I think the reaction to the River Seym, can the Russians get over that and start making sure that the lodgement has gone, or is the Ukrainians have not got as much territory as they did. But I think the other thing that I'll be tracking really is the general responsible for this area is a general called Lapin, if that's how you pronounce it, rabbit really in French. He was the guy who really lost all the Kharkiv land, 3,300 square kilometers in 2022 with the Ukrainian counterattack. He's the guy responsible for this. So at some stage, but it would send a bad message, so I don't see it in the next week, but in next month or 6 weeks, he will go. And because of the fact that this has happened on his watch as the theatre commander, and I'm not sure Putin likes the advice he's been given, it would be interesting to see if Gerasimov goes, who I think is the 5th theatre commander, and of course also has been for 11 or 12 years the chairman of the general staff in Russia. So where is the purge going to come? And I think there will be a purge in the Russian military because this is something which shouldn't have happened on both of their watch, and someone is going to be held responsible for that.
Major General Chip Chapman, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.